This is Anita Plummer, who is an assistant professor of African Studies at Howard University, whose research focuses on African political economy, emerging markets, transnationalism, and Sino-African relations. Her current book project on Sino-Kenyan relations examines local, national, and transnational narratives of South-South cooperation. Before joining the faculty at Howard University, Anita Plummer taught international studies at Spelman College. She was also a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Cultures in Transnational Perspective program and visiting assistant professor of global studies and political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Additionally, she was a fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Center and predoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia. So this is going to add to our perspective. We've been getting every day, every speaker has given us a different facet of this broad subject. So please welcome Anita Plummer.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Susan, for inviting me. I want to give you an non-academic bio really quickly so you understand how I came to the topic of China and Africa, because you're practitioners, so I think maybe some more information about how I came to study this may be useful for you. So I'm from Baltimore City. I studied Mandarin in high school at the public school. From there, I was involved in grassroots organizing and activism. I landed a job somehow in Chinatown, San Francisco, organizing youth around housing justice and environmental justice issues. Made it back to Baltimore City, did some more youth organizing and community-based organizing, and I was granted the opportunity to go to Africa. And for me, that was very powerful because as someone of African descent, going back home is always, a pilgrimage that it wasn't even on my horizon. So that was in 2004. So I went for a training with other organizers and activists from across the continent, landed in Kigali, Rwanda, the capital of Rwanda, Kigali. We took a road trip to Lake Kivu, which is right on the border of the DRC, and we're riding on the roads, and I asked one of my Rwandan colleagues, I'm like, whoa, this road is smoother than the roads in Baltimore. I don't know if you've ever ridden on Baltimore streets, but they're pretty bad. And my colleague said, the Chinese built this road. I said, what? So here I am, I'm like, whoa, there's more to this story, and that birthed my interest in studying China and Africa, and that's the path that led me here to you today. Understanding how local communities understand and interact and influence global forces. So Dr. Douglas's work in making these global connections on a grassroots has been very powerful, and I'm very thankful to have the opportunity to interact with you. So I hope this presentation isn't too academic-y. So I'll give a formal presentation, and then I want to open it up for us to have a conversation on your understandings of African perceptions of China's engagements across the continent. So as Dr. Douglas mentioned, most of my research focuses on Kenya. I've done field research in South Africa, Mozambique, Senegal, and Zambia. But today I'm going to focus on Kenya. I'll bring in some cases from other African countries, but I like to stay in my lane. And I like to have some specificity when we're talking about such a diverse continent and such a big country, China. Okay. So the 2006 Beijing summit marked a new phase in China's engagement with Africa. Under the maxim of friendship, peace, cooperation, and development, 41 heads of state and other high-level government officials from Africa were present. Currently, the 53 African states with diplomatic ties to China have experienced an expansion of financial flows which have expectedly created parallel contact zones, mediated by formal state structures, foreign direct investment, and on a grassroots level, migration from China. Whether it be temporary labor migrants developing Africa's infrastructure, or Chinese women working as urban market sellers. These interactions, or in many cases transactions, are not uncommon in African countries, as Chinese migrants have reconfigured local economic landscapes. The Chinese government is navigating the finite space between creating a positive image and earning a positive reputation in Africa. Local communities are narrating these encounters, confronting and redefining spaces of cultural production and exchange. Interactions between Africans and Chinese people present opportunities and challenges for both African governments and Chinese state-run private firms working there. In response to this, China's public diplomacy is aimed at promoting its Africa policy while trying to maintain a positive reputation on the continent. China must maintain mutually beneficial relationships between public and private actors involved in Sino-African trade, aid, and diplomacy. African governments aspire to maintain strong ties with China while ensuring that they engage with Chinese people on the ground in Africa and also in China. So on the local level, there are a different set of expectations and attitudes about the increased ties between China and African countries. Diverse African publics are experiencing the connectivity of their countries in local marketplaces, advertising campaigns, new and traditional medias, higher education, and within formal legal structures. So these are just some images that I want you to have in the front of your mind as I continue. My research tries to untangle and interpret the multi-layered processes by which diverse African and Chinese communities are simultaneously navigating and narrating new sites of cultural production and exchange using both state, formal, and private, informal platforms. Today, I'm going to briefly talk about how China tries to shape their image in Africa, and then a little bit about some African perspectives of China's engagement. So my presentation is divided into three main parts. For the first part, or first level, I look at how the Chinese government tries to influence African publics. So that's one level. I think it's important to understand how the Chinese state is responding and reacting to different currents of conversations of what's happening among diverse publics. And for this case, I'm going to use a case in which China uses historical frameworks to try to influence local Kenyan publics. I then am going to go into popular understandings and look at some attitude polls that were done in Africa. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I just want you to know that there have been some polls done on African attitudes toward China. And then finally, the meat of the presentation, I'm going to present some street level vignettes, and I'm going to look at the specific case of the standard gauge railway in Kenya. So that's the roadmap for today. Hopefully I won't talk for too long, so we can have dialogue around some of these issues. So China's international public relations and diplomatic principles have scarcely evolved since the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung in 1955. I'm not sure if someone covered that, but that was a conference that took place that brought together radical, progressive, and communist leaders from Asia and Africa who were struggling against imperialism and against colonialism in their countries. And that was a very important moment for the continent of Africa and Asia in terms of bringing together grassroots voices to present an alternative narrative to the West. And that's a moment that Chinese diplomats evoke when they talk about the enduring ties between Africa and China. Today, China's public relations strategy is rhetorically inspired by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the Chinese dream of peaceful development. This provides a foundation for China's brand, but it's based on a particular set of assumptions, which I'll mention later. I place this discussion within a public relations framework. Kunzig defines public relations between nations as the planned and continuous distribution of interest-bound information by a state aimed mostly at improving the country's image abroad. International public relations are designed to introduce, integrate, and legitimize institutions of communication. This term is often interchanged with propaganda. I'm interested in this concept of interest-bound information, the intended audiences, and the assumptions being made by political agents, whether they're Chinese political agents or in this case, Kenyan political agents. The international dimensions of China's public relations, especially in developing nations, are based on the assumption that the Chinese model of PR and the values that they project are universal. For example, China's emphasis on its history of empire is deeply embedded in Chinese culture, and the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics was a coming out for China, reintroducing itself to the world after the mishandling of Tiananmen Square massacre. The 2008 Olympic ceremony emphasized China's pre-modern history as a central part of its culture, and thus the foundation for China's contemporary rise. This also is an impetus for the history of contact between Africa and China. China is the central part of this narrative, and its emphasis may be better suited for domestic audiences, not necessarily African audiences. And I'm going to demonstrate what I mean by this. So in Africa, in Kenya in particular, Chinese diplomats have used historical narratives to make the case that African nations and China's mutual destinies are bound together through a carefully crafted history. In this case, the most effective tool to project foreign policy and international public relations is through mass media. This is not an arbitrary strategy, as the Chinese government began working with public relations firms in the 1980s aimed at shaping their image to US audiences. One case that I look at is the use of history in international public relations in the creation of what I call a usable past. I think you all already covered some of this earlier, so I'm not going to get into it. I'm going to talk about how this pre-modern history is actually utilized. The medieval and pre-modern history between East African and Chinese civilizations has been largely marginalized from Western, Chinese, and African historical narratives. According to historians like Frederick Hegel and Hugh Trevor Roper, Africa only recently entered history through slavery and its colonization by Europe. However, Chinese diplomats present an alternative reading of Africa's place in history, which corresponds with this narrative of the China alternative and the historical and cultural links between the country and the continent. So I call this case an origin story of Sino-African ties. According to Kenyan folklore, and this story is based here on Lamu Island, I did field research there in 2010. According to Kenyan folklore, a ship capsized, a Chinese ship, that was purportedly a part of one of Zheng He's fleets, capsized between 1415 and 1418. And the Chinese survivors swam to Kenyan shores and became integrated into the coastal community of Lamu. According to oral history, the Chinese sailors proved themselves to Malindi residents by killing 2 pythons that had been tormenting the village. The Chinese were allowed to stay and marry local women, forming an African-Chinese community with descendants living today on Kenya's coast. Fast forward to 2002. Enter Mamwaka Sharif Lali, a Kenyan woman from Pate Island, who is conjectured to be the descendant of one of these shipwrecked Chinese sailors from the 15th century. Labeled by the Kenyan and Chinese press as a, quote, Chinese girl, Sharif Lali's identities were distorted to fit the imaginations of both Kenyan and Chinese publics. A veritable origin story of Sino-Kenyan ties had been crafted to shape the attitudes of both Kenyan and Chinese publics. This brings into question the core values that are embedded in these narratives and whether or not African publics are actually accepting them. In my field research, I found that Kenyans on Lamu Island, they weren't accepting this story. In 2002, Chinese experts visited Sharif and her family. She's the daughter of a Lamu fisherman, and they used DNA testing to confirm her Chinese heritage. She was chosen as a representative of Chinese descendants in Kenya because she, along with her mother, 2 sisters and 2 brothers, may currently be the only descendants on the island of 7,500. Her brother completely denied this narrative in the press, he said. I don't know where this story is coming from, but you know that identity can be functional. A report from the Chinese embassy in Nairobi stated that Sharif has rightfully been nicknamed the Chinese girl. And this is a quote: "Her complexion and facial features tell a story." Now, if you go along the coast, east coast of Kenya here, you find that historically there was a lot of mixing. So it's hard to really equate facial features, especially Chinese facial features, to any of the communities there, because people look very diverse. In 2005, and that's where this slide is from, she traveled across China using her Chinese name, Sharif Wu, on a media tour and participated in celebrations marking the 600th year anniversary of the Zhenghe expeditions in Taitan. Sharif later received the scholarship to study in China. The Chinese Ministry of Culture produced a documentary film about Sharif's story called The China Girl. The film is regularly shown to guests at the embassy in Kenya, and Sharif's story was also featured at the Africa Pavilion at the 2010 Shanghai Expo. Again, the Chinese media identified her as Chinese, and according to interviews, Sharif referred to herself as Chinese, downplaying her African identity, which is understandable that she would do that in this space. The Chinese government used Sharif to show that they have a deep ancestral connection to Kenya. For China, Sharif represents the culmination of Kenya and China's historical contact. It is also worth noting that an exhibition at the Yunnan Nationalities Museum had a 2008 exhibit titled Zhenghe, the Great Navigator, Diplomat and Envoy. And it was here that I actually learned about the community of descendants, Chinese descendants living on Africa's coast. So they featured photographs from Pate Island. There was a small caption that read, "They're Chinese descendants living on Pate Island to this day." So this case corresponds with a national public relations campaign promoting Africa and China's historical ties, which is also useful in China in terms of justifying China's engagements with African countries. So the story does not end here. In 2010, the Kenyan and Chinese governments began 2 archaeological projects on Kenya's coast. The first was an excavation of a site in Mambrui here. So they excavated near the Khatib Mosque, which was a part of the Kingdom of Malindi. So there were 2 sites here. And the archaeologists from the National Museums of Kenya and their counterparts in China excavated a Chinese vessel that sank 600 years ago near Lamu Island, again, building this canon of evidence of these lasting ties. This ship was believed to be one of those in Zhenghe's fleet. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce funded the 3-year project, which included Kenyan archaeologists being trained in underwater excavation. So here is one site, here's the other site. Both projects were examples of China's quest to resurrect and literally unearth a history that connects the 2 countries. For China, this project reinforces a usable history that contributes to China's grand history as a benevolent partner in Africa. And this has become a matter of China's branding. Now, this case was not without scandal, and this is where the street level perspectives come in. Local Muslim communities protested the archaeological digs because they did not adhere to Islamic laws. So there was a lot of bad press in Kenya around this dig in particular. And the joint Sino-Kenyan excavation team had to issue a series of statements countering these negative media reports. In the statement, they framed these projects as correcting a perception of East African history, one that focuses on, quote, rewriting Kenya's history of discovery. And of course, they're clapping back at the Portuguese that arrived after Zheng He, that didn't come with this, supposedly benevolent fleet, but they came with guns, disease, literally to raid the same villages that Zheng He had visited 75 years earlier, right? So this is the narrative. They're positioning themselves as different from the West, historically. So the story of China and Africa's pre-modern contact appears in speeches, local newspaper op-eds, government reports, you name it, it's everywhere. The history that was once ignored or forgotten currently has a place in the Sino-African diplomatic arena. This history has been excavated and used primarily by Chinese diplomats to create a glorious past that they hope will strengthen their ties with African nations. The Chinese government attempts to find common links in very creative ways to present itself as a reliable alternative to the West. China does not have the obvious historical links and linguistic ties of the former metropoles. As a result, the challenge for Kenyan and Chinese leaders is framing contemporary relations, economic relations, within a historical context that at least appears uncontrived. For Chinese leaders especially, the facts of this history are not as important as a vision, a viable, unbroken heritage and past that flourished in the absence of Europeans. So China attempts to manage its image and persuade audiences using other tools. So in 2011, with the launch of CCTV Africa, which was launched in Kenya, it reports 24 hours a day on issues related to trade relations, migration, infrastructural projects, health projects, you name it, that's covered on this network. And this has become a somewhat effective tool for China's optics management in Africa. Studies have shown that African publics aren't even really watching CCTV Africa. Of course, you have to have access to cable to see it, but people really aren't consuming CCTV Africa. You have China Radio International, which is also based in Nairobi. And then there are at least 2 newspapers that are aimed at Chinese migrants in Africa. In South Africa, it's another case. There are quite a few publications that are in Chinese. China's media outreach also supports African-based media houses, and it's working on establishing its own outlets to correspond with its global strategy, to present itself as an alternative partner to Africa's development. There are also Confucius Institutes. During the Q&A, if you want to talk about that, I can share a little bit more about Confucius Institutes. We have them here in the United States. They're housed within local universities or schools, and they mostly teach Mandarin language. So using these tools of diplomacy, the Chinese government consistently stays on message with its pronouncements of win-win cooperation and its subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, juxtaposition with the West as a benign, non-hegemonic partner who has been ideologically and economically aligned with countries in the global South. As Kenneth King, who studies China's soft power in Africa, rightly observes, the Chinese government avoids using paternalistic language and that echoes the donor-client relationships of African nations in the West. In most cases, political decision makers in China consciously use the language of mutuality, which frames the relationship as equal and non-hegemonic. Along these lines, the vivid descriptions of Africa and China's pre-modern contact and then their support and struggles against colonialism provide a historical foundation for the contemporary relations. Moreover, these images and accompanying narratives occupy a space along the conspicuous economic and political transactions between African and Chinese officials, firms, and individuals in Africa. So now that we have an idea of the top level image cultivation, which is mostly handled by political agents, I want to go a little bit into opinion polls. And I have some issues with these polls, but I think you should know that they're out there. And I'll explain some of my issues. So the Pew Research Center has the Global Attitudes Project. So when we're thinking about African perceptions, when asked, respondents generally have a more positive view of the United States in terms of the US being seen as a model for a developed economy, more so than China. So here, you can just look at this graph. Is there anything surprising here? You all can stop me at any time if you have any questions.
Nigeria.
Yeah. It's interesting that, and this was done in 2016, that, and the political environment has of course changed. It's interesting that Nigerians have a more favorable view of China as a model for development than the US. And this is linked to the idea of China being an underdeveloped country and has been able to move forward using policy, whereas with the US, the history is a bit different. So another major survey of 36 African countries was conducted in 2014 and 2015. This is the Afrobarometer survey. You can Google it if you want to actually read more specific results. But the results are similar to the Pew Research poll, in which China ranks second as a development model behind the US. And it's the greatest has the greatest external influence aside from their former colonial powers. Is there anything surprising about this? Here, this map shows the light gray are countries that tend to have an unfavorable image of Africa, all the way to the dark, which has an 80% response rate of China having a somewhat or very positive influence. So as you can see, Ghana, Algeria, and Egypt, there's some issues going on there with China's public relations. People tend not to look at China favorably in those countries. And there have been some incidents there. But generally, Africans, at least the 36 countries that were surveyed, have a favorable image of Africa. Is anyone, are you all surprised by that? No? Okay. Yes?
The only thing that I was surprised about is first, the previous slide. I would think the United States would have a better image in South Africa. I say that because I'm old enough to have lived through this, because I know, and I don't think that the apartheid was dismantled specifically because of the United States. I remember Randall Robinson, the late Randall Robinson, may he rest in peace. He started the street protests, and they gained popularity throughout the nation. And of course, when the people are in the streets in such numbers, the lawmakers pay attention, and the sanctions against South Africa was passed, full House of Congress. I believe the Reagan vetoed it, if I remember correctly. The veto was overridden, and that's how and why apartheid was dismantled. So,
does anyone want to respond to that? In terms of South African perceptions of the United States?
Yeah, my perception during my era, I just learned about what apartheid was. I didn't understand it, but I understood it meant segregation. And the perception that was told to me was that Dutch and Europeans came and invaded people that were already living there to break them of their diamonds and resources. So that's my perception. And as to this day, there's still segregated areas where the Dutch will prevent the native people that are from that actual land to live. So there's still a lot of friction to this day, especially with the new millennials. There's statues of the person, I forget his name, that actually did the statue.
Yeah.
And so I believe they knocked it down to 1 or 2, so I really see South Africa mirroring what's going on in America. So,
Okay.
Maybe the people who were polled, if they were white South African, then they may not have been so enamored with U.S. activity. But if they were African Americans, then maybe they would have voted a little higher. So we
Yeah.
don't know who was polled,
Yeah, the
city folk or
breakdown.
rural folk.
Yeah. So with the Pew Research poll, I actually don't know if race was asked with the South African sample. Class and gender are disaggregated, so you can actually get the data, and geography in terms of rural versus urban. With Afrobarometer, you can get a breakdown. But I don't remember, especially with Afrobarometer, hearing if they asked about race. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it was U.S. policy to support the apartheid regime.
Yeah.
But I mean, going back to the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I think that, with all due respect, there was an awful lot of international networking and advocacy that the South Africans themselves did through the ANC in Europe, in the Netherlands, actually, very powerfully in London, and that I would venture that many, like South Africans especially, have a very vivid memory of the U.S. colluding with the apartheid regime.
Yeah, so that, you're on the money. So, you know, I have learned this being on the ground, that people have a very nuanced view. And as Americans traveling, if you've ever been abroad, usually people understand the difference between the government and individuals. So on the ground in South Africa, if you're not representing the U.S. government, you'll be perceived very differently because of the role of activists here in the U.S. In the struggle against apartheid. So I've been to South Africa with groups of activists, and there's a profound level of respect for activists here in the U.S. that go there. However, I have friends in the State Department who go to South Africa representing the U.S. government, and they have a very different experience. There is a profound level of distrust against the U.S. government to this day in South Africa. So that's where these nuances come in. So that's why South Africa's perceptions of the U.S. wouldn't be as high as we would think, because that historical memory is there, that the U.S. regime helped keep apartheid going for longer than it had, even though U.S. activists played a crucial role, along with activists, of course, not only in South Africa, but in all Southern Africa, in bringing down the apartheid system. So those memories are there, yes.
Hi, I was in college in the 80s, and the president of my college was South African, white South African. And I remember being one of the students who protested the divestment of South Africa in school, even though my scholarship was coming from South African money for me to go to school. I still took the chance. And one thing I remember talking to President Rosemary Ashby is that I said, I understand, you know, money and how it works, but you are like the last college next to Harvard to be the last to divest. They were not going to divest. I was threatened to be thrown out of school, but I was very, very stern about that. And so you're right, U.S. contributed to it, and they knew they were. And of course, push came to shove, and they had to eventually. But in the 80s, it was a very, very tense topic. And schools, the universities, the Ivies, were not going to divest.
And it took activism for that to change. And it went from divestment to sanctions, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about divestment, it was about sanctions against South Africa. Okay, so any more comments on that? All right, so this graph shows, just so you understand a comparison of where China is in terms of attitudes, alongside former colonial powers, the US, even South Africa. So this shows the greatest external influence. The dark red is China, yellow is the United States. Look at Mozambique. Isn't that something? People perceive China as having the most influence in Mozambique. Kenya 38%. So you see how these perceptions are powerful and why the Chinese government put some, I don't want to say they put a significant amount of resources, I don't want to blow it out of proportion, but you see why the Chinese government wants to help shape and cultivate a positive image on the continent. All right, so now we're going to get into the heart of some of the vignettes. So I want to begin with the case of the standard gauge railway. I said earlier that local communities are narrating these encounters, confronting and redefining local spaces and channels of exchange. I want to pose some questions for you to think about for our discussion as I go through these vignettes. How are we, people who are interested in China and Africa, to understand the tensions, opportunities, and ambiguities in the local, national, and transnational encounters between diverse African and Chinese communities? I should have said this in the outset, that Chinese communities in Africa are extremely diverse. I think you all probably have heard that this week. So we can't lump Chinese into one category. And that poses a problem for the Chinese government because the average person on the ground doesn't know that, you know, one person from China may be representing, you know, a small private firm, another may be a farmer, someone else may be from Hong Kong. The average person doesn't know that. All they see is writ large, hey, this person is Chinese and they're in my communities. The government, the Chinese government is well aware of this, and that's another reason why they want to shape perceptions on the ground. So I propose looking at counter channels to provide virtual, online, or real interpersonal spaces where individuals can express their views on their government's engagements with China. So another point that I want to note is people tend to engage how their governments are interacting with China. So people may not directly critique China. They ask, how is my government mediating these relationships? How is my government behaving in a way that benefits my needs as a citizen? So it's very nuanced. So on the street level, how are ordinary citizens understanding their own government's relationship to China? And what tools do people have, especially those with limited political space, to influence policy? And finally, have organizations or individuals been successful in influencing their own nation's foreign policy? These are the questions that I'm grappling with in my research. So I think you all have already talked a lot about infrastructure, right? Yes?
To some degree.
Okay. So China is emerging, or has already emerged, as a major financer of infrastructure projects across Africa. Has anyone here been to Africa? Okay. Has anyone encountered a Chinese project, Chinese individuals in Africa, talked to someone who mentioned China?
Construction road in Uganda.
Okay, so tell me what you saw, or what you heard when you were in Uganda.
I think the Ugandan see Chinese in a positive way, you know, participating in the construction of their country, material construction.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Yeah.
Oh, I was there 2014 in Joburg and talking to some entrepreneurs about why they were starting a Chinese language school. And yeah, we were talking about we're coming and people are going to want to
Were they
learn.
Chinese or South African?
These were Chinese people actually,
Okay.
but they did say, because I said, well, you know, who's helping you?
Yeah.
And they said they were collaborating with locals to get the school
Okay.
running.
Yeah.
So I was seeing Learn Chinese Today signs everywhere. It was blowing my mind.
Yeah, you see newspaper ads of these private schools. Yeah. So in addition to the Confucius Institute, which are for most part free, you have these private schools opening up. Okay, so I actually want us to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Any other encounters, anything that folks have heard or witnessed? Okay. So usually the feedback I get is when you go to Africa and you link China and Africa, infrastructure is the first thing that comes to mind. People building roads. Western countries, well, the United States in particular, stopped doing infrastructure a long time ago. They stopped in the 1980s. So China has really entered that space. So sub-Saharan Africa lags behind other developing regions on most standard indicators of infrastructural development, especially in the energy sector. Coincidentally enough, there are Chinese projects in the energy sector, but most tend to be in the transport sector. Okay. So the rationale is that you develop infrastructure in African countries, the cost of doing business goes down, and then you can attract foreign investment. So that's the rationale behind why China is investing a lot in infrastructure. Why else do you think China is investing in infrastructure?
To create their own Chinatown.
Okay, so to create what?
Their own Chinatown, their own villages and their own.
Okay, so to help facilitate migration in, what else?
Transfer economy also.
Okay, to help transfer goods both
Yeah.
in and out, okay, what else?
Roads.
Yes,
Reduce unemployment in China and create demand for Chinese products and materials.
okay, I'm happy you said that. So that's gonna be at the center of this perception issue, the issue of labor. Okay, so it's not just about the infrastructure, it's the process of infrastructure. Who is carrying it out? Who should build Africa's infrastructure? Who was responsible for the first wave of infrastructure in Africa? The colonial powers, right? And why did the colonial powers invest in infrastructure? To help facilitate, these economic transactions, whether it's getting resources out of Africa and European goods in. Okay, so these parallels are being drawn on the ground. All right, the parallel of Africa's first wave of infrastructure during the colonial period, and then this newer wave of infrastructure that's meant to maintain the colonially developed infrastructure or engage in new projects. So you mentioned Uganda. Kenyans are generally very optimistic about China's role in developing infrastructure. The opinion polls reveal that. However, my research, and this is where the opinion polls fall short, is asking more questions. People tend to be very sophisticated in their views of China's engagement in the transport sector. I found in my interviews that people were well aware of how precarious their position was because of asymmetrical power relations and the lack of transparency in the arrangements between the Kenyan government and Chinese-owned firms. What does that mean? Okay, the Kenyan government takes out a loan to build, say, the Thika Road Highway, which connected Nairobi to the town of Thika. Where did the financing come from? China. 85% came from China. The African Development Bank financed the rest. So they're public tenders. They're in newspapers in which the government says we're taking bids to build this highway, either in sections or the whole highway. Kenyan firms, of course, bid on these projects. There are Kenyan firms on the ground. I interviewed Kenyan business people, architects who actually run construction firms. And they gave me some insight into the tender process. What do you think happens? So you have Kenyan firms bidding on contracts, and you also have what? Chinese firms. You also will have European firms. American firms really don't engage in they weren't involved in the Thika Road. So who does the contract go to? Yes, the China Roads and Bridges Corporation, which is a large parastatal. Why did they win the tender? Why do you think they won the tender? Yes, lower cost. So in my interviews, the business people said, we have the human capacity. We have the skills to do it. It's not as if we don't have Kenyans who can't build roads. Our overhead costs are a lot higher than the CRBC, or Kenya Roads and Bridges Corporation, because they're a multinational corporation. So of course they're not going to win the bids. So that's the Thika Road project. I'm going to talk about the standard gauge railway, which was also carried out by the China Roads and Bridges Corporation. At the time that the tender was released, that the MOU was signed, there was a conversation in Kenya around the issue of youth unemployment. At at that time, 85% of youth were unemployed, and that's people between the ages of 15 and 32 years old. So there was a conversation happening online, in churches, in the media, you know, at bars. Our unemployment rates are skyrocketing, and specifically it's targeting youth. So the Kenyan government signs this MOU. The China Roads and Bridges Corporation, they win the tender. What do you think the public relations were during this period? I mean, say you're the Kenyan government, high unemployment rates, people are talking about it, this large project comes in. If you're a government official, how are you gonna frame this? You're gonna say this project is gonna bring jobs. So Kenyan officials, they went on a media campaign and said, the standard gauge railway, which connects Nairobi to Mombasa, the port of Mombasa, is going to bring 30,000 jobs to Kenya. And there was a level of excitement, but also some skepticism because of the history of China Roads and Bridges in Kenya. So, and again, the Kenyan government was responding to these conversations happening on a local level. We need to address youth unemployment. So back to the standard gauge railway. In 2015, a story circulated online that President Uhuru Kenyatta personally carried out negotiations with the CRBC on their hiring quotas. Despite this effort, there were a number of protests across Kenya. You can Google these protests. In different regions along the train's route because of poor wages, substandard living conditions of Kenyan workers compared to their Chinese counterparts. In one case, stories were circulating that in a factory producing train cars, there were safety and health hazards, lack of sanitation facilities, exposure to hydrocarbon emissions from lack of issues related to lack of furniture in the metal shacks in which people lived. And local media began reporting these complaints that workers had. And this was not new to Kenyans because the Thika Road project I mentioned earlier, people were protesting that too. In multiple cases, there were protests over also lack of access to employment opportunities given by the CRBC. I'm sorry. So, fast forward, the railway opens last July. 2017 was the inaugural ride. You see this beautiful terminus here. It was received with great fanfare. And remember, the president personally negotiated the hiring quotas. Keep that in mind. So, at the time of the opening of the highway, officials of the railway board reiterated Kenyans did most of the construction, no one argued that, and that Kenyan engineers were hired to maintain the railway. This was the narrative being put forward. 400 Kenyans were trained to maintain this railway. However, last month, in July 2018, almost a year to the day that the train opened, an investigative journalist in Kenya revealed that 4,954 Chinese nationals had been working on the railway as managers, train operators, surveyors, welders, secretaries, engineers, accountants, and cooks. So the rhetoric was not matching the data. The investigative journalists found this out because they got access to the visas that were issued by the Kenyan government. Now this is interesting because remember the unemployment conversation that started in 2012? The Kenyan government also changed their immigration policy in 2012 in response to issues related to unemployment. So the Kenyan government reportedly had stopped issuing employment permits to foreign workers who had earned less than $1,900 US a month. Why? Because the argument is workers who aren't experts, technical experts, who are doing jobs that don't necessarily require a specific skill set can be done by Kenyans. So that was the policy on the books. And interestingly enough, Asian immigrants were targeted in terms of this policy, this immigration policy. And we can have a conversation too later if you want to about issues related to xenophobia. So here you have this investigative report. The Kenyan government is shelling out 1 billion shillings a month to pay for the almost 5,000 workers, Chinese workers, that are doing everything from, you know, working as cooks to being actual train operators. So of course, this scandal has erupted on the news. Kenya Twitter is great. So you see these critiques circulating. Okay. Yeah, so this is the standard gauge railway, and you see this Kenyan cartoonist has the tracks going over dead Kenyans. So one of the trending hashtags was SGR slavery. Okay, so I mentioned the immigration law changing. So this tweet says, did someone just say jobs to Kenyan youth? Worry not, the SGR is employing positions 5,000, qualifications Chinese nationals.
Anita,
Yes.
yeah, I'd like to ask, maybe you know how to confirm this. I spoke with a Sudanese businessman. So he went back to Sudan and China and would buy containers and containers, clothing like that, and sold in Sudan, and then eventually he became a millionaire there. And he said like this, see, like qualification Chinese nationals only. So like the road construction workers that I saw in Uganda, they are most Chinese. Just like at the embassy here in Washington, D.C., Chinese embassy employed Chinese workers.
Yeah.
So I heard from the Sudanese businessman saying that the prisoners in China, they were given choice. If you want to stay in China, you stay in prison. But if you want to be free, we will ship you abroad to work in this Chinese construction. How much is this the truth?
Okay.
You as a scholar.
You bring up, so I just finished submit an article. I just had an article accepted on Chinese prisoners, and there's a rumor of Chinese prisoners operating in Africa. And I'll put it to you this way. This came up in my interviews, and I actually didn't know about the rumor until my interviews, in which people said, oh yeah, the Chinese workers are prisoners. They're white-collar criminals that are serving out their time here. And I went cross-eyed, I was shocked. But I shouldn't have been shocked, because this rumor had been circulating since the 1990s in Africa. And the conclusion I came to, my argument is that whether or not the rumor is true is inconsequential. Okay. It's what people are observing in terms of the working conditions of Chinese laborers. That's what's important. So the rumor came about, I mentioned the company camps. There's this idea that the Chinese, companies bring in workers. The workers live most of the time in isolated compounds, and they move along with the stretch of road. So there are these enclaves that move along with the road. Mm-hmm. After the construction is completed, they go back home. Locals who observe this, what they see are, hey, these people are working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. They're not allowed to leave the confines of the work camp. They're not intermingling with us. They're not going to local bars. Who would possibly want to work like that? Oh, only prisoners would be forced to work like that. So that's the conclusion I came to, is that I can't prove whether or not there are Chinese prisoners working there across African's infrastructure projects. However, people are observing the plight of Chinese workers and some Kenyan workers, and they're saying the working conditions are so inhumane, they must be forced to work that way. That's how I'm going to answer that, because Yeah, that's a rumor that's circulating. I think it's very xenophobic. I think it feeds into this idea of yellow peril, that the Chinese are going to come and take over. But I wouldn't say the rumor is unfounded. You find a lot of people saying, oh, it's unfounded. I can't confirm it, but I think the rumor is powerful. And I think it says a lot about foreign intervention in Africa. And it says a lot about how Chinese companies are treating their own workers and African workers. That's also related to issues of race and racism, which in Kenya, issues related to racism and sexism have been the subject of protests of Kenyan workers who've been verbally and physically abused by bosses, Chinese bosses. So it's there. But yes, I have heard that. Another issue with the standard gauge railway is the environmental issue. So the environmentalist movement in Kenya has really pushed back against the standard gauge railway. The first phase, there's a second phase that is supposed to go through Nairobi National Park, which is a refuge for wildlife. So we've seen protests not only related to labor issues and issues related to race, but also environmental issues. Yes.
I'm getting a little confused. I missed something here. Is it a fact that these Chinese workers are working in Africa 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and not allowed to go out and mingle with the locals?
No, I don't think that's a fact at all. I think it all depends. It all depends on who you talk to in the job site. There are diverse actors operating. I have read pieces that have, including a statement by the former Chinese ambassador to Kenya, who reacted to these prisoner labor rumors publicly and said, this is the Chinese work ethic. So that was his response, which I think is very problematic because that's very loaded, but I don't think that's a matter of fact. This rally just took place in June 2018. Environmentalists are protesting the opening of a Chinese-run coal plant, guess where? In Lamu, the home of Sharif Lally. So they were there in 2002, and I know I was there, and I saw surveyors and engineers from China when I was doing my field research. I'm like, what's going on here? And they had plans for these coastal towns. So everything is related. So it's not goodwill just for the sake of goodwill. It's linked to economic interests and extraction in Africa. So these paintings are by a Kenyan artist critiquing. Did you all see these already? Oh, okay. So I'm not gonna. Okay. Oh, okay.
No, but go ahead.
All right.
You have your perspective.
So in his inspiration for this piece, he said that African leaders are mortgaging Africa to China. And this is what I mean about how nuanced and sophisticated local communities are. They're not just blaming the other, China. They're calling for remediation for their own governments to be accountable to their needs.
Oh, sorry, can you put
Yes.
that back? Thank you.
Yeah, you can Google Michael Soy.
Okay.
He's quite prolific. Now, his work, his canon of work, yes, it's controversial, but he goes after corrupt pastors in Kenya, leaders. I mean, it's not just the Chinese.
He comes
He's
to
an
America
equal
sometimes.
opportunity. I don't know if he's delved into U.S. issues, but he's an equal opportunity critiquer of power in institutions in Kenya. So you see, he predicts that by 2030, the chair of the African Union is going to be Chinese.
The funny thing is, I said that yesterday in our group discussion.
I mean, it's tongue-in-cheek because the Chinese government funded and built the African Union headquarters, and there's a scandal that the Chinese had bugged the African Union headquarters, so he's responding to that.
Was that a gift or a loan?
That's a good question. I actually don't know. That's a good question. If a loan was taken out, it was probably a gift. Yeah, it was probably a gift. You see, the leaders are asleep behind. So here you have a Chinese man recovering in bed, and he of course needs Africa's titanium, copper, oil, gold. And the African woman represents Africa. And this exhibit was banned in the national museums, and they said it was because of the nudity. Like, it wasn't because of the nudity. And you see the doctor, you know, has his Tusker, which is a Kenyan popular Kenyan beer. It's a great beer. And here Tusker comes again in this painting. I didn't mention the ivory trade. That's another issue in Kenya that the Chinese government is really trying to, with the ban of the sale of ivory in China. Of course, the industry has moved to now Laos, but the Chinese government is trying to reshape this perception that, here's another one. We didn't talk about that, but on social media, there are these trends in social media, and I encountered it myself with workers from China, you know, having African women as escorts, but you see this a lot, and a lot of, mostly in this case, Kenyan men are angered by this when they see Chinese men and Kenyan women. So you'll see a lot of this. And then finally, Xi Jinping is in quite a few of his
So we were trying to
Yeah.
figure this one out. Is it
Yeah.
like drinking the Kool-Aid?
serving in their tea, which, because it's a teapot.
1 minute. It's like,
But I would
we
assume
couldn't
this
even take
idea
it the other
of
day.
the handouts, Africans taking whatever they can get from China, that's what I interpreted it.
yeah,
And looking up to,
yeah, I see it as tea. Tea is soothing, it's calming.
Yeah.
So they're being placated, so nothing else
and
matters.
tea is very popular in Kenya too. Kenya is known for their tea, so it can be interpreted that way also. So did you all have any other questions for me in terms of perception? Very complicated issue. Yeah.
Yeah, just, you know, thank you for your great presentation. I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts based on your research and your just own personal life on Lu Jing's situation, the black girl who was Chinese and she was on China, you know, that whole.
Okay, the
and
young
the
woman who
racist-
was on the.
China Got Talent and
Yes, yes, yes.
and the racism
Yeah. Oh,
that
yeah.
came out
Right,
after
yeah,
that. If
yeah.
you, I don't know if you
Okay.
followed that and had some
Yeah.
kind of thought on that.
In my experience, I can only speak from personal experience as a black woman in China, but racially I was a bit ambiguous. So based on conversation I've had with friends, including Chinese friends, it's been my experience that Chinese people can be very prejudiced even against other Chinese people. I spent most of my time in Yunnan province, which is home to most of the ethnic minorities in China. So they're non-Han Chinese. And there was severe exploitation and oppression of Chinese ethnic minorities. So for me, it's not too much of a leap. I'm not that surprised when there is discrimination and racism against blacks in China, including Chinese blacks. That xenophobia it's not surprising. It's not like, oh. Now, there's a film that just came out, Wolf Warrior 2, which is based in, you all talked about that?
It's just
Where
our
I'm
first
like,
lecture was like Wolf Warrior 2.
where when the Chinese government then, you know, is involved in reinforcing stereotypes of black people in Africa, I'm like, they should know better than that.
Okay.
But on an interpersonal level, it's not surprising to me whatsoever. We've seen violence in Hong Kong against, you know, people from rural China, from ethnic minorities. There have been studies, and if you're interested, I can send you some studies of Chinese-owned companies, attitudinal studies, looking at how they view African workers. And some of the comments that they told researchers, I was shocked. They said some of the things they said about blacks.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be cool to see.
Yeah. I'll send it to you, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll shoot that. All right, yeah.
When you're talking about blacks, are you talking about nationalities associated with pigmentation, or are you talking about, you said when you were traveling,
Yeah.
and you were being seen as a U.S. citizen versus,
Oh, I didn't say that. I was not seen as U.S. I'm American. Believe it or not, China. I was not. Yeah. So in terms of, when I say blacks in China, it can be anyone of the diaspora who's African descended, whether they're American blacks, African blacks, because for some Chinese, they couldn't believe I was American.
really?
This was in the mid-2000s when I first encountered this. And what I would tell them in Chinese, when I went, I figured out how to just tell them, hey, Barack Obama, he's American, he's black. I'm like, Barack Obama, you know? Or they assumed I was from Africa or India. So, yeah, if you're black in China, it's assumed that you're from Africa, not American. Even though Kobe Bryant, I would say, oh, Kobe Bryant, you know, he's very popular, he's black, you know, he's American. But I think Barack Obama changed that, changed perception of blackness in China quite a bit. But that's not my area of expertise, okay? So I'm not an authority on that. Thank you. Thank you so much.